So I thought this was a big deal, right? I thought this is like, when you see it in the news, you're out there giving congressional testimony, there are a room full of photographers and everyone's interested in this. So we did this, we marched to Washington, we actually convened this meeting, and there were a lot of very bright, extremely bright, but very young congressional staffers in the room. Not a single congressman or senator. But what I didn't realize at the time was that this gets into the congressional minutes in terms of this, and I still don't understand why, but the folks at the ACLU decided to read that, and they thought this was a matter of free speech. I still don't exactly get that one, but this was a matter of free speech, and they thought that this was a very important thing to be able to bring forward. And very long story short, we decided that amongst the genes that were patented, the ones that would have the biggest public impact were actually BRCA1 and 2, because of the women and men that get breast, ovarian, pancreatic cancer is associated with this. And very long story short is this eventually went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and as many of you know, it overturned the ability to patent genes. For any of you that... So for any of you that can explain this to me, you can look at the stock for Myriad Genetics, which was the one laboratory that owns this. Right when that announcement came out, their stock price actually went up. I still don't understand that one. But anyway, eventually came down because what we were able to do with that is now to democratize this, now to open this up so that many, many laboratories could compete in a good way. We have been able to, for the public, take for the same, actually not even the same price. You guys just told me it's really a tenth of the price, and be able to get 10 times the information. And so with that now, this is something that's very much accessible to men, women, those with a family history, without a family history, and been able to go well beyond just BRCA1 and 2. But now many of you may know that we can actually test for even as many as 50 genes at a single time that tell us not just about one type of cancer, but tell us about many, many different types of cancers. So the reason I say this is because some of you actually got testing in the days of BRCA1 and 2, and you thought to yourself, oh, I was getting breast or ovarian cancer testing. My testing was negative at that time. So this is the news flash for you. If the testing was negative, and if we did not understand why your family, you or someone else in your family got cancer at that time, it's time actually for an update, because we now have much better testing. Number one, it's much better because we've got much better methods to look at our genes, much better because there are many more genes that we can look at, and much better because it's much less expensive, and so people can access it. Access it either because your insurance company is paying for it, in rare circumstances because we have people that end up paying some other way for it, but it is time to be able to get that updated information, because whether it be for you, we want to make sure that we keep you healthy, and that if you've had cancer, you don't go back and get cancer again, and also more importantly, or as importantly, I should say, for your family, that you can actually be the person to give hugely helpful information to other people in your family, be it, as I said, your brother, your sister, your kids, your grandchildren, but that information can be incredibly empowering and incredibly important. I personally am a believer that knowledge is power, that if you know what it is that you need to avoid, you can take steps to avoid that. They don't have to be things that are sort of life-changing or life-altering in a bad way, but simply by being vigilant, knowing what to be careful about, knowing how to be screened, when to be screened, with whom to be screened, all of that information can be life-saving. As we've done that, I'll also say that I don't know if any of you thought you got screened, but if anyone thought they'd got screened by doing a 23andMe test, who's heard about 23andMe? Okay, so if any of you thought you got screened for any of the cancer genes by 23andMe, you could have. So if you're Jewish, the BRCA1 and BRCA2 genes for Jewish individuals are included in that test, and it actually ends up being a very good test for that. If you're anyone else, so either if you're not Jewish or there are any other type of cancer you're worried about, that test is completely and utterly useless for you, except that you may be able to find out where your ancestors were from. You may be able to find out a long-lost distant cousin or something like that, but it will not help you for the genetic information itself. So just word to the wise and warning for that. You, too, might think about cancer testing, but not the 23andMe type. So these are the genes that we call genetic genes. So for anyone who wasn't awake, now you know. So these are the genes that we know for 2019 that are very powerful genes. So what I mean by that is when we talk about that, some of these genes confer a risk of, no kidding, 60, 70, 80% chance of developing some type of cancer over your lifetime. These are cancers that can be preventable, but they are no joke in terms of this. There are other genes that are genetic. And what I mean by that is some of those genes, they're wimpier genes. They may confer something like a 10% risk of cancer or a 15% risk of cancer. And you can imagine if you're Angelina Jolie, you're making a different decision if you think you've got a 70% risk of breast cancer as opposed to if you think you've got a 10% risk of breast cancer, right? So part of what we're doing, and this is now the next frontier, is actually the research to try and identify the genetic factors that we still don't know, as well as many of those genetic factors, which are actually much more common as we look out at individuals. And it's going to take a little time. We're for sure not there yet, but as we're doing this, we are banding together. And so these become international studies to be able to understand this, to bring the power to these. These genetic studies, believe it or not, they're not just studies of 100 people or 1,000 people. These are now studies that get up to be like 200,000 individuals. We have things like the Breast Cancer Family Registry, the Colon Cancer Family Registry, the Pancreas Family Registry, all of these things. And one of the things we're starting to realize is that when you thought you had a colon cancer gene, we now know from work that we've done that also confers risk of breast cancer. So it's not just because it's colon, but there are mixtures in understanding between cancer genes over here and conferring different genes over here. And even if you didn't see that cancer in your family, it might not be that it's not going to come up for the first time in the next generation. And so in a good way, though, again, we're empowering people in terms of what cancer do you need to worry about? When in your life do you need to worry about it? And more importantly, what can you do to take care of it? So I'm just going to wrap up by saying things are changing. There is a lot still of work to be done. For those of you that are interested in helping the next generation for knowledge to be power, I encourage you, when it's convenient, when it's possible, participate in research. It's important to be able to come up with the answers for tomorrow for the questions we still have today. But as this is changing, times are changing very rapidly. Continue reading what you're seeing in the New York Times. It is helping you to keep you up to date with this, but things are changing rapidly, and if we don't have answers for you today, I surely hope we have answers for you tomorrow. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Dr. Chung. We are now going to open it up to questions, and I have Monica and Mercedes who will be at the opposite sides of the room with microphones. So if you can raise your hand if you have a question, they'll come to you and give you the microphone so everyone can hear your question. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I have an adopted daughter from China. And because she has no knowledge of her genetic history, and she's 22 now, I'm wondering at what stage she should have any form of testing, either the BRCA test or any other form of genetic testing.
Yeah. So it's very timely because I just came back from being in Beijing and being in China on Wednesday. So I have a very good sense now of what current genetics are in China. So there are a couple things. The first question is, let me ask you this. What do you think the cost now is? Well, let me rephrase that. How much do you think it cost us to sequence the human genome the first time? The first human genome, what did that cost? $3 billion. What do you think it cost me for the last human genome I sequenced? $99. Not quite. But close, $999. Okay. Now, how much did it cost me to understand that information? I'm still not there yet, but it cost us about $10,000 truly to understand that information. So it's all about you. So for your daughter in particular, one of the things this is no joke, I went to China about was specifically because our ability to understand the Chinese genome, as opposed to, for instance, an Italian genome or a Finnish genome, we are far behind right now. And in part, one of the messages to give you is that for different, the four corners of the world, if I were to cover that, I have to know what looks normal in those communities to know what looks different. And right now, I can sort of talk talk to you offline about this. One of the limitations is that for China, they actually will not allow information, genetic information, to come out of the country. And so one of the things we're doing is actually working with Chinese investigators to make sure they learn faster within the constraints that the Chinese government has given us. So the bottom line to your answer is she's only 22 at this point. So I'm not really worried about her breast or other cancer risks really for about the next decade reasonably. By the time she gets to a point where we start worrying about risks, and by the time she's starting to do things like planning her family and what she wants to do about children, I will have this one for you, I promise. So within that period of time, we will be able to get her genome sequenced and understand it, and I bet you it's going to be for about $500. So for now, just told her to just be a young person, enjoy life, don't worry about these things, and I've got this one.
Thank you. Hi, I'm just curious, as far as getting genetic testing, where and how that's done these days. I mean, I know in the past you had to go to a genetic counselor and set up a separate appointment. Is it any more accessible through your regular doctor or OBGYN or?
Yep. So the answer is a very good question. So the logistics of this are that any physician is capable of ordering the genetic testing for you. And I actually think an informed consumer is a good person in this. If you have a doctor, and it can be anything from an internist to an OBGYN, in theory can help you with this. I will tell you that some of them either don't feel comfortable or don't understand this information well enough, and so they won't feel comfortable ordering the test for you that you need to. Certainly genetic counselors, cancer centers in general, so many oncologists are much more comfortable with this, even though you don't have cancer necessarily in terms of that. Worst case scenario, and I'm sorry I don't have a business card or something to give you, literally Google me, find my email account. I will personally tell you and connect you with someone in terms of being able to do this. It is not quite as easy as you can just go up to 23andMe and order a kit, but we are trying to get it much, much easier, much more accessible. You can get results in about 3 weeks, so it doesn't take that much time in terms of doing it. We have figured out ways to do it even from saliva samples, so you don't even have to, if you're afraid of needles, you don't even have to get blood draws anymore. So we've taken away some of the obstacles, but you will need to connect with a physician to be able to order the testing for you.
I'm a little confused in terms of BRCA1, BRCA2, and full genetic testing. If you go in for a BRCA1, BRCA2, are you getting the whole deal or just part?
Yeah, so if you literally go in for BRCA1 and BRCA2, you are only getting BRCA1 and BRCA2. Many people these days, when they're going in for we'll call it a panel of genes or a number of genes for cancer, they're going well beyond BRCA1 and BRCA2. To me, that's the current standard of care, is to go well beyond BRCA1 and BRCA2. But the standard of care, I would say 4 years or more ago, was only to do BRCA1 and BRCA2. And so if your testing was done in that era, it's time for a refresh, time for an update. And do the whole thing.
Hi. This question is kind of related to a previous question, but in a family where there already is abnormal BRCA gene, what age should children be tested, and should it be a different age for daughters and sons?
Very good question. Okay, so for those of you who already know you're at increased risk, and I'm going to say specifically in a use case for BRCA1 or BRCA2, we really don't see any cancers before the age of 25, and so in terms of thinking about that, I don't personally recommend testing before age 25 unless someone gets really anxious and nervous about this. We definitely don't recommend testing for children, so for individuals aged less 18. We feel like people ought to make their own decisions, and they ought to be able to get their heads around making those decisions. For men, the cancer risks really don't begin before 45, and so to your point, if you're a guy, you don't, for your own personal health, I don't think you really have to before 45. I will say it's something that's very, very individualized, but certain couples think about whether or not they want to prune their family tree. So whether or not when they're having children, they worry about passing this on to their children. And it's something I can talk about if people have questions, but for that, obviously for a gentleman, if he's younger than 45, he needs to know his status for that issue.
As a wine lover, there was a recent article in the Times, I believe the study came out of the UK,
regarding the influence that alcohol has on cancer. And I was just curious, the end of the article, I guess the synopsis was that zero alcohol is best. I'm just curious what alcohol does to the expression of genes and any more current information that you have.
Yeah. So from a very practical point of view, I don't worry at all for someone who's having one drink a day. So one glass of wine, a beer, whatever, I think that's perfectly fine. The thing that gets complicated is I think you have to consider all your health risks in total. So I think you have to consider, I don't know, at least I worry about cancer. I also worry about heart disease. I worry about Alzheimer's. I worry about the whole package of things. And for me, the balance is, as I said, if you want to drink, drinking one drink a day, I think is very reasonable and helps with that entire risk profile for all of your health. We do know clearly if you're going to either binge drink or if you're going to do a lot of alcohol, 3-4 glasses, per day, clearly you're going to have other health risks that go with that. But in terms of that as a general sort of off-the-cuff thing, that's a general sort of good rule to live by.
Hi. I'm asking a question about a young man who is 41, who has no female relatives to test, but has a 16-month daughter. So can men have the BRCA tests, or how do they go about it?
Okay, very good. So very specifically, men obviously, so with the BRCA gene, BRCA1 and 2, or any genes that have to do with breast cancer, ovarian cancer, even though men don't usually get breast cancer, they can with BRCA2 specifically. And importantly, they can still transmit the gene just as strongly to their daughters as a woman can, right? And so if you're thinking about your family history, don't disregard your father's family history, ladies. Your father's family history is just as important as your mother's family history, right? So now the thing that I think about for your 41-year-old young man that you're talking about, and I do this calculation in my head, what does his family history look like, in terms of what's the likelihood that he carries, whether it's BRCA1 or another gene, what is his ancestry? If he's Jewish, there is a higher likelihood. Also, if he's from Iceland, there's a higher likelihood. If there are certain parts of Germany, there's a higher likelihood. But we think about all of those things together. There is a movement afoot for people to think about even a healthy adult screen. So you may not think about this too much, but we think about from a genetic point of view, at what point would we go to what I call population-based screening? So not just because of your family history, because for reasons we've heard about today, some people may be adopted, some people may not know their family history, some people it may be that there's a dearth of women, and then that's why we